On the night of March 9, 1945, as the calendar turned toward March 10th in the Western Pacific, the vast dark waters between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese home islands began to hum with the sound of aluminum and radial engines. A droning chorus that would crescendo into one of the most devastating single attacks in the history of aerial warfare, an operation that would incinerate roughly 15.8 to 16 square miles of Tokyo, claim an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 civilian lives in a matter of hours, and leave more than 1 million people without shelter, their homes reduced to ash and twisted metal in a firestorm so intense that it generated its own weather, its own winds, its own apocalyptic logic. The architect of this transformation in American strategic bombing doctrine was Major General Curtis E. LeMay, a man whose blunt features and unlit cigar had become synonymous with the kind of cold operational calculus required to wage industrial war against an enemy who showed no sign of surrender, and who had spent the early months of 1945 wrestling with the grim arithmetic of the B-29 Superfortress campaign against Japan, a campaign that had, until then, relied on high-altitude precision. Bombing of military and industrial targets, a strategy borrowed from the European theater but one that was failing spectacularly over Japan due to the jet stream winds at altitude, persistent cloud cover, the difficulty of hitting small targets from 30,000 feet, and the simple stubborn fact that Japanese war production was dispersed throughout densely packed urban neighborhoods where workshops and small factories occupied wooden structures indistinguishable from homes. LeMay had inherited a troubled command, the XXI Bomber Command, and faced pressure from Washington to justify the enormous investment in the B-29 program, the most expensive weapons project of the war, and he understood with brutal clarity that the Pacific War would not end through negotiation, that invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, and that the only path forward, the only way to shorten the war and save those lives, might be to bring the war home to the Japanese people with such overwhelming force that continuation became unthinkable. So LeMay made a decision that would haunt historians and moralists for generations. He ordered a shift to low-altitude night incendiary attacks against Japanese cities, stripping his B-29s of most defensive armament to increase bomb payload, sending them in at 5,000 to 9,000 feet instead of the usual high-altitude runs, loading them not with high-explosive ordnance but with incendiary clusters designed specifically to ignite the wood and paper construction that characterized Tokyo's residential districts, particularly the densely populated working-class neighborhoods of the Shitamachi, the low city along the Sumida River, and areas like Kamaido where tens of thousands of families lived in structures that might as well have been kindling. The weapon of choice was the M69 incendiary bomblet, a hexagonal magnesium device about the size of a large firecracker that burst on impact and scattered jellied gasoline that stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, igniting everything it touched, and the bombers also carried smaller numbers of M47 devices filled with jellied gasoline and white phosphorus, an element that ignites spontaneously in air and burns with such intensity that it can sear through metal and flesh alike, and when packed into clusters these bomblets would spread across city blocks like a rain of dragon's teeth, each one capable of starting its own fire. Hundreds of fires, thousands of fires, fires that would merge and consume entire neighborhoods before residents could comprehend what was happening. On the airfields of Saipan and Tinian, on the evening of March 9th, ground crews loaded approximately 334 B-29 Superfortresses with roughly 1,665 tons of these incendiaries, and the men who would fly them, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, flight engineers, radio operators, gunners, went through their pre-flight rituals with the kind of grim professionalism that had become second nature, checking fuel lines and oxygen systems, running through checklists, stowing their gear, some writing letters home, some playing cards, some simply sitting in silence and smoking cigarettes under the tropical stars, and among them was a young flight engineer named Michael Harada, a Nisei from California whose parents were at that moment interned in a camp in Arizona, and who had volunteered for combat duty to prove his loyalty, and who now sat on the tarmac and watched the ordnance being loaded into the belly of his aircraft and wondered what his distant relatives in Tokyo might be doing at that very moment, whether they were sleeping, whether they had any idea what was coming. The mission was designated Operation Meetinghouse, though the men who flew it knew it by simpler names: the Tokyo Raid, the Big One, and it was led by Brigadier General Thomas S. Power, a wing commander known for his meticulous planning and his willingness to fly the missions he ordered. And as the sun set over the Pacific and the first bombers began their takeoff runs, engines roaring, wings heavy with fuel and fire, there was a sense among the crews that this night would be different, that They were crossing some threshold from which there would be no return, that the war had entered a new and darker phase. The flight across the ocean took hours, the bombers flying individually or in loose formations, navigating by stars and dead reckoning, and as they approached the Japanese coast the pilots descended to their assigned altitudes, far lower than they had ever flown over enemy territory. Low enough that the crews could see the landscape in detail, the outlines of cities, the grid of streets, and the Pathfinder aircraft went in first, dropping incendiaries in a calculated pattern designed to mark the boundaries of the target area and create a burning X visible from high altitude, a fiery perimeter that would guide the following waves and trap everything inside. And then the main force arrived, wave after wave, approximately 279 to 282 bombers reaching the target, each one disgorging its clusters of M69s and M47s, and the ordnance fell through the cold night air like metallic rain, tumbling, spreading, and then igniting on rooftops and in streets. And in courtyards and gardens, each bomb lit a small sun, and within minutes the fires began to merge. In the neighborhood of Kamaido, in a narrow house wedged between a noodle shop and a textile workshop, a woman named Fumiko Tanaka woke to the sound of distant thunder that was not thunder, and she went to her window and saw on the horizon a glow that seemed to pulse and grow, and she woke her 3 children and her elderly mother and told them to dress quickly, to gather their emergency bags, the ones they had prepared months ago with a change of clothes and a little food and a few precious family photographs, and her youngest daughter, Keiko, 7 years old, insisted on bringing a small silk pouch filled with her grandmother's spices, the scent of star anise and ginger that represented home, and Fumiko did not have the heart to say no, and they went into the street and found their neighbors already outside. Faces turned toward the sky where now they could see the bombers, dark cruciform shapes against the stars, and the bombs falling like scattered seed, and then the first fires bloomed around them, not 1 or 2 but dozens, hundreds, the buildings down the street erupting in flame, the heat sudden and enormous, a physical force that pushed the air from their lungs, and Fumiko grabbed her children and ran, joined by a river of humanity all moving in the same direction, away from the flames, toward the canals, toward the parks, toward any open space that might offer refuge, but the fires were spreading faster than they could run, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, driven by winds that were themselves created by the heat, the air above the fires rising so rapidly that it sucked in fresh oxygen from the edges, creating a cyclonic effect, a firestorm, a phenomenon that had been observed in Hamburg and Dresden, but which now manifested over Tokyo with a ferocity that exceeded all previous examples, winds gusting at speeds estimated between 30 and 50 miles per hour, winds that carried embers and flaming debris, winds that knocked people off their feet, winds that turned the city into a blast furnace. From the cockpit of his B-29, flying at 7,000 feet, Michael Harada could see the firestorm developing below, the individual fires coalescing into a single vast inferno that glowed orange and red and white, a light so bright that it illuminated the underside of his aircraft and cast shadows inside the cockpit. And he could smell it too, the acrid burnt smell that found its way into the cabin despite the altitude. A smell like scorched hair and rubber and something organic and wrong. And his pilot, a laconic Texan named Jack Morrison, said over the intercom that it looked like hell had opened up, and Harada thought about his relatives, about whether they lived in this part of the city, about whether they were down there now, running or hiding or already gone, and he forced himself to look away, to focus on his instruments, to monitor the fuel consumption and the engine temperatures and the oxygen supply, to do his job because that was all he could do, because the alternative was madness. On the ground the canals became death traps, hundreds of people jumping into the water to escape the heat only to find that the water itself was heating up, that the surface was covered with flaming debris, that those who submerged to avoid the flames suffocated or boiled, and the bridges collapsed under the weight of panicking crowds, and the parks where families had fled offered no protection because the firestorm created its own weather, raining embers and superheated air, igniting clothing and hair, and people lay flat on the ground and pulled wet cloths over their faces and prayed. And many died not from burns but from asphyxiation, the fire consuming all the oxygen in the air, turning the atmosphere into a toxic mix of carbon monoxide and superheated gases that seared lungs and stopped hearts. And Fumiko Tanaka and her family made it to a canal and huddled on the bank, and she held her children close and covered them with her body. And the little girl Keiko still clutched the silk pouch of spices, and the heat was so intense that the stones of the canal wall glowed red, and the water steamed, and Fumiko prayed to ancestors and to Amaterasu and to any god who might be listening, and somehow, through luck or grace or the whim of wind, their section of the bank was spared the worst of the flames, and when dawn finally came, gray and terrible, they were alive, though the world around them had been erased, replaced by a landscape of ash and twisted metal and smoking rubble that stretched as far as the eye could see. A gray desert punctuated by the skeletal remains of buildings and the shapes of bodies, thousands of bodies, blackened and curled and unidentifiable. And the air was thick with what survivors would later describe as black snow. Ash that fell like snowflakes. Ash that tasted like the last pages of a book. Ash that coated everything and everyone. Ash that was in some measure the physical remains of the city and the people who had lived there. By the time the last B-29 turned for home, by the time the sun rose on March 10th, roughly 15.8 to 16 square miles of Tokyo, approximately 41 square kilometers, had been burned to the ground, an area larger than the destruction caused by the atomic bombs that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 5 months later, and the death toll, while impossible to calculate with precision in the chaos that followed, was estimated by Japanese authorities and later historians at somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people, most of them civilians, most of them women and children and the elderly, the men being largely absent, fighting in distant theaters or working in factories outside the primary burn zone, and more than 1 million people were left homeless, their possessions reduced to nothing, their neighborhoods erased, their city transformed into a graveyard. In Washington and in the press, the raid was presented as a strategic necessity, a blow against Japanese war production, a means of disrupting the cottage industry networks that supplied the military, and there was truth in that framing. The targeted area did contain workshops and small factories, but the truth was also that this was fundamentally an attack on a civilian population, an attempt to break the will of the Japanese people by making the cost of continued resistance unbearable. And Curtis LeMay, in his post-war memoirs and interviews, never apologized for the decision, arguing that it saved lives in the long run, that it contributed to the Japanese surrender in August and thus made unnecessary an invasion that would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese lives. And there is a cold logic to that argument, a utilitarian calculus that weighs the dead of March against the hypothetical dead of November. But it is a calculus that offers no comfort to the ghosts of Kamaido, to the memory of children who suffocated in shelters, to the families who vanished in fire. The operation had precedents. The Doolittle raid of April 1942 had been the first American strike on Japanese home islands, a psychological blow more than a military one, and the RAF's campaign against German cities had demonstrated both the feasibility and the horror of area bombing, but Operation Meetinghouse represented an escalation, a refinement, a perfection of the art of destruction, and it was followed by similar raids on Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities. A systematic campaign of urban incineration that by war's end had killed hundreds of thousands and left Japan's major cities in ruins. Michael Harada survived the war and returned to California and never spoke of what he saw over Tokyo that night, the light and the smell and the knowledge that he had been part of it, and he worked as a mechanic and raised a family and died in 1987, and his children only learned of his service from records they found after his death, and they wondered what it had cost him, what memories he had carried in silence. Fumiko Tanaka survived as well, along with her mother and her 3 children, including Keiko, who kept that silk pouch of spices for the rest of her life, and they lived in a refugee shelter for months. Then in a shack built from scavenged materials, and slowly, painfully, Tokyo rebuilt itself, rising from the ash like some grim phoenix, the streets laid out again, the buildings reconstructed, first in wood and later in concrete and steel, and by the 1950s the city was growing again, and by the 1960s it was thriving, a symbol of post-war rebirth and economic miracle. But the survivors carried the scars, the memories, the dreams of fire and the faces of the lost, and every March there were quiet ceremonies at memorials, offerings of incense and flowers, and the debate continued, in academic journals and public forums, between those who saw the raid as a war crime, a deliberate massacre of civilians, and those who saw it as a tragic necessity, a harsh choice in a brutal war. And the debate was never resolved because it cannot be resolved, because the dead remain dead and the suffering remains real, and the consequences of our choices in war echo through generations, shaping nations and haunting memories and posing questions that have no comfortable answers, questions about what we owe to the enemy, about the limits of military necessity, about the value of a life weighed against strategic objectives, about whether the rules of war mean anything when survival itself is at stake, and perhaps the only honest response is to remember, to bear witness, to refuse the easy narratives of heroism or villainy and instead to sit with the complexity, with the moral weight, with the recognition that on the night of March 9, 1945, human beings made decisions that ended the lives of other human beings on a massive scale, that those decisions were made for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, that those reasons do not erase the horror, and that we who inherit this history must grapple with it, must ask ourselves what it means, what it demands of us, how we should remember the civilians caught in the machinery of total war, and if you've stayed with this story to the end, if you've let yourself imagine the heat and the ash and the faces of people like Fumiko and Keiko and Michael, then I ask you to subscribe to this channel to ensure you don't miss future explorations of history's most challenging moments, to like this video if it made you think or feel something true, and to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the moral calculus of strategic bombing can ever be justified when it involves the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, or is there a line that should never be crossed no matter the strategic stakes? And how should we as a global community remember and honor the civilian victims of war?